turn to English as the numbers go up here, number of participants. We've just crossed the mark of 50, 54, 56, 59. It's and counting. Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. É um grande prazer e uma honra para a Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso organizar este evento hoje com Gershon Baskin. Nós tivemos um probleminha de última hora com o Guga Chakra. Ele não pode se juntar a nós, mas nós agradecemos imensamente aqui ao Marcelo Lins, da Globo News, outro jornalista da melhor qualidade. Acho que foi uma bênção divina que nos permitiu encontrar um substituto à altura do Guga, aos 45 minutos do segundo tempo. Então, muito obrigado, Marcelo, realmente encarecidamente em nome da Fundação. I would like also to thank a group of like-minded institutions that got together to make this happen, and they are Editora Edra, Instituto Brasil-Israel, and Peace on the Table, an initiative led masterfully by Sheila Munn. Sheila, thank you so much. My personal gratitude and the institutional thanks of the Cardozo Foundation for that opportunity. Well, it's hard to, in a nutshell, to introduce Gershon Baskin, but I'll try to do that concisely. Gershon was born in New York in 1956 and migrated to Israel in 1978, if my memory serves me well. And he defines himself as a social activist, political entrepreneur, and I would add public intellectual dedicated to the cause of peace between Israeli and Palestinians. He has founded an institution dedicated to that cause. Let me read the name, not to make any kind of mistake. Founder and co-chairman of Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, and it was later renamed, and you tell the new name of the institution. The important thing, it has been dedicated to that cause for more than 30 years. Is a columnist with the Jerusalem Post, a well-known figure, very respected figure, has served as an advisory to the peace process right after the Oslo Accords under the leadership of the Yitzhak Rabin. I think it's very opportune that we hold this conversation today, 27 years after the Oslo Accords, and 25 years after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin on November 4, 1995. And the question is the two-state for two people solution still holds? And if not, what are the alternatives? That's, I think, is the question hovering this conversation. But I have already said and talked too much, and I would like to hand it over to Marcelo Lins, who will conduct the interview with Gershon Baskin. Thank you all. I will reiterate that it's an honor for the Cardozo Foundation to host this conversation. Please, the floor is yours, Marcelo.
Marcelo,
Okay.
just a
Yes.
second. I just
Yes,
like
of
to tell our audience that we have a possibility. I just speak in Portuguese, ok? É o seguinte, quem quiser, nós temos aqui uma tradução simultânea, tá? Para o português. Então, aqui na tela, embaixo da tela, tem um lugar escrito Interpretation. Basta clicar ali, você vai ter a opção em ouvir em inglês ou em português, ok? Obrigado.
Okay. So, good morning, Otávio. Good morning, Sergio. Thank you very much for your kind words. Good morning, Mr. Bashkin. It's a pleasure and an honor also for me, and I think it will be for any journalist to have this opportunity of talking to you in this particular point in time. And I would like to start our conversation, first of all, thanking you as well for talking to us, but taking from the point that Sergio left us there. this chronology, let's say, or this point in time, 25 years after the assassination of the late Yitzhak Rabin, the man that was apparently at some point poised with the chance to make the biggest progress in Israeli-Palestinian talks and the peace process itself, of course, with Yasser Arafat at the time. And I think that the world that is seeking peace for so long in that region, that's such an important region of the world, had really big hopes at the time, and the assassination couldn't have taken place in the worst time. And I'd like to start this conversation with a quite broad question to you, which is, where are we right now regarding the peace process, this stale peace process for some years now, and what are the perspectives in the near future, let's say?
Right. First of all, good morning, everyone in Brazil. Good afternoon from Jerusalem. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, and to the Foundation for sponsoring this, and the other friends and organizations, especially Sheila. We have no peace process. Peace process has been dead for years. There have been no negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians for quite some time now. And even when there were negotiations, it was a dead-ended road from the outset. The Israelis and the Palestinians are not in a place to make agreements today. We lack the leadership in both Israel and Palestine of people who are willing to negotiate a fair deal between the two parties that would enable us to create a two-state solution for two peoples living here. We have a history of agreements that were signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that were flawed agreements, but the biggest problem that we had was that they weren't implemented. We have a history of Israel and the Palestinians taking upon themselves obligations which they don't fulfill, and then blame each other for failing to implement the agreements, never taking responsibility on their own side for their own failures, always blaming the other side. And we're at a point today where it's impossible to imagine, with the current leadership that we have, a new set of negotiations at this point.
Mm-hmm. And taking from that, I'd like your view also about the latest peace plan, so-called, that was put on the table by the US government. And really, weirdly enough, without the participation of the Palestinians in this peace plan. They say that they are ready to welcome them in the process, but they weren't in the peace plan. Do you think there is something there that we aren't seeing, or is just something that it obviously can't work?
Right. I think it's quite obvious that the deal of the century, as President Trump called it, it died on November 3rd. The Palestinians called it from the outset the steal of the century, not the deal of the century, because it assumed, before even starting negotiations, that Israel would annex 30% of the West Bank. That, for the Palestinians, is a non-starter. From the Palestinian narrative, when they agreed to go into the Oslo peace process, they compromised on what they believed was 78% of their homeland. If the Palestinians, in going to Oslo, assumed that they would create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, that's 22% of the land between the river and the sea, and they were prepared to recognize the state of Israel within the pre-1967 borders, accounting for 78% of the land between the river and the sea, which one side calls Eretz Israel and the other side calls Palestine. But the Palestinians had no willingness, no readiness, even today, to compromise on the 22% when they believe they gave up 78%. So any deal which presumes that they will have to make compromises on the 22% can only be accounted for as being practical if there is the element of territorial swaps involved, which is what Prime Minister Olmert had negotiated with President Abbas. But of course, those negotiations never made it to the final line also.
Still following, Mr. Basking, this path of negotiations or accords and treaties, I'd like to hear your take on the recent deals made with the help of the United States, between Israel and some Arab countries, some Arab monarchies, some Gulf states, to say the two of them, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates.
And
What
Sudan.
the sort and Sudan afterwards, exactly. But mainly in this Gulf states and even Sudan. But what sort of effects do you think that this can have in future negotiations if they happen to be started again?
Right. I think it's unfortunate that the Palestinians didn't embrace those agreements and see them as opportunities and ways to perhaps strengthen their own position vis-a-vis the State of Israel. The Palestinians were relying on what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, which was launched in March of 2002, which was created by the Arab countries as an incentive for Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. Essentially, the Arab Peace Initiative said to Israel, if you withdraw from the territories you conquered, occupied in 1967, you allow for the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. We have a just and agreed solution to the refugee problem. Then Israel would have a welcome mat for peaceful, normal relations with the entire Arab world. And later, the countries of the Conference of Islamic States joined in. So we were looking at possible welcome mat normalization of 56 countries with the State of Israel on the condition that Israeli-Palestinian peace be negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
The peace deals arranged by President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, it basically closed the door on the Arab Peace Initiative. And it worked to the benefit of Netanyahu and Trump, saying that we can ignore the Palestinians from now, we can push them to the side, we can have peace with the other Arab countries. Israel already has peace with Egypt and with Jordan, and now we can broaden that peace from the outside, and then maybe the Palestinians will wake up and say, hey, we want to join in as well. The problem is, of course, that making peace with the Emirates or Bahrain or Sudan requires no compromises from Israel on anything. It's only for the benefit of Israel. It is for the benefit of those Arab countries as well. I say that it might be helpful because I think that when Israelis travel to the Gulf, to Bahrain, to Abu Dhabi, to Dubai, and see a different image of Arabs, not the image that they're used to seeing as the Palestinians as the enemy, but they come to an Arab country which is friendly and welcoming and open and modern and technological, that perhaps Israeli attitudes will change. I think it will also enable those countries that will have friendly relations with Israel to apply more friendly pressure on Israel to move forward with the Palestinians. But that will require leadership changes first on the Palestinian side, which we will have to see. The Palestinians need to get their political house in order because they're divided between West Bank and Gaza, between Fatah and Hamas. And nonetheless, I still think that those Arab countries can have a positive impact for the Palestinians if the Palestinians are more welcoming to the idea of peace with those countries. Now, it seems that it is. President Abbas yesterday announced that he's resending his ambassadors back to the Emirates and back to Bahrain after he had recalled them after the Abraham agreements were signed.
Mm-hmm. Let's see how this works out. Another thing I'd like to hear you about is what can we expect of the changing of the guard, let's say, in the US in January next year with, of course, the Biden government starting, if Mr. Trump would let it happen as it should.
Right.
Are you hopeful for any changes between Israeli-US relationship, or do you think that we'll see more of the same, even in a democratic government?
I think that the issue of Israel and Palestine is going to be very, very low on the agenda of the Biden administration. They have the COVID crisis to deal with, the economic collapse of the world, and in particular America, that's going to be much higher on the agenda and much more in the focus. I think that the immediate change that we will see is that the US administration will renew official contacts with the Palestinian Authority. I think that they will reopen the American consulate in Jerusalem, which is the primary American governmental office dealing with the Palestinian Authority. The US government will renew financial aid to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA, the refugee agency of the United Nations dealing with Palestinian refugees. I think that they will allow the PLO to reopen up its office in Washington. That will immediately change the atmosphere, the environment. The US government will no longer be seen as an enemy from the Palestinian side. I think regarding Israel, we will see backtracking in the new administration from the steps that we saw just yesterday with the US Secretary of State visiting an Israeli settlement for the first time in history and announcing that Israeli settlement products will be labeled in the United States made in Israel, which has never happened before. I think we'll see a backtrack on that. We will not see a backtrack on moving the US Embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. I think that's a fait accompli that the US Embassy is in Jerusalem and will remain in Jerusalem. In a paper that I wrote of brief recommendations to the new Biden administration, I wrote what I had initially written to the Trump administration as well, and that a plea for them not to start a new American-led peace process. This is what we don't want. I think it would be much more useful for the American government to say to the Israelis and the Palestinians, you guys need to get back to the table. When you're ready and you need our help, call us. We're not going to initiate something new. We have to be conscious of the fact that American-led negotiations between Israel and Palestine have been the worst negotiations that have ever taken place. The Americans are not an impartial third party in this conflict. They are a biased player, biased toward the state of Israel. And it is much more important that the Israelis and the Palestinians find a way of talking to each other than each of them talking to the US government.
And as you mentioned, the issue of the US Embassy in Jerusalem, do you think that it's also a fait accompli that the Jerusalem status won't be back in the table in any time soon, or is there something that there's still room for it to be one of the things that must be discussed between Israeli Palestinians when there's really two sides willing to do that?
Right, Jerusalem is the centerpiece of the peace process, of any potential peace, and without Jerusalem, there is no peace and no chance of peace. This has to be recognized and known by everyone involved in this conflict. When President Trump moved the embassy, he initially said that the Israelis and the Palestinians would need to negotiate the permanent boundaries in Jerusalem and that the US was not determining the issue of sovereignty there. He later said, a few days after that, said that he had removed Jerusalem from the table. If you remove Jerusalem from the table, there is no table. There's simply no place to negotiate. Jerusalem is a binational city today. Almost 40% of the residents of Jerusalem are Palestinians who are not citizens of the state of Israel, who do not have political rights in the state of Israel. They are here as temporary residents, essentially. They can have their residency rights removed. They can have their homes demolished and taken from them. They can be arbitrarily treated in this city, both at the municipal level and the national level, in a way that we've seen over the last 52, 53 years, in a way that no people would agree to live. Jerusalem is the political capital of the Israeli Jewish people and the Palestinian people. It is an international city in its importance to the world as the center of monotheistic religions, and it has to be the centerpiece of any future peace in the region between Jews and Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
And if you think about peace as a process that we need to pursue, and that's the title of the book from 2017, In Pursuit of Peace, and sometimes we really have this impression that we are pursuing peace or chasing peace, and it always is running ahead of us, and it's very difficult to catch this peace. But we know of your relentless work. We know of your work with the liberation of Gilad Shalit, as well, the soldier that was kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists and everything. And we know that to move forward in this peace process, in any peace process, it was like that in Northern Ireland, it's like that in some African countries, it's like that in Israel and Palestine. We need to talk with our enemies, not only with our friends. We need to have a broad approach to it. We need to have a bold approach to it. And do you think that there is any chance of this group of protagonists in this process, not only Israel and Palestine, be also broadened? And there's a question here from Sheila that she sent us kindly as well. asking, for example, do you think that there is any possibility of Iran be part of any future negotiations, or is this something unthinkable?
Well, let me touch on the Iranian issue
Okay.
first, and then we'll go back to Israel-Palestine. Iran has become much more problematic during the years of the Trump administration because of the Trump withdrawal from the international agreement with Iran on reducing its nuclear stockpile and the monitoring and verification mechanisms that were put in place. Iran is in fact much closer to a bomb today than it was 3.5 years ago when Trump entered the White House. And I think we need to recognize that Trump's sanctions on Iran pushed Iran closer to a bomb rather than further away from the bomb. There were problems with the agreement, and I think everyone recognizes them. The rainbow clause, I think as it's called, or the ending of the period, the fact that the negotiated agreement didn't deal with ballistic missiles or with the spread of terrorism in the region. These are all issues that need to be dealt with. But I think that the strain in relationship between Iran and the United States has driven Iran further away from the possibility of entering into some kind of peaceful negotiations with the United States, with Israel in the future. I know that my friends in Iran, I've had friends in Iran over the years who saw themselves as part of the democratic opposition within Iran over the last years have been afraid to talk to me. The regime has become more repressive and more directed against people who oppose it. Where just 3-4 years ago, there was a lot of thought around the international community that the opposition to the regime of the Ayatollahs was growing, and that there was a chance perhaps in the future of overthrowing that regime and having a democratically elected, more liberal, more progressive regime coming in Iran. I think we're far away from that today. Normalizing relations with America and with the rest of the world will help to reduce those tensions internally in Iran, and I hope that's a process. I believe that's a process that the Biden administration will enter into and rejoin the agreement and try to negotiate additional agreements with Iran. And I hope that will help reduce the tensions between Iran and Israel, because essentially there's no conflict between Iran and Israel. It doesn't exist. I mean, Iran supports the Palestinian people, but Iran had, within the framework of the Conference of Islamic States, agreed to the Arab Peace Initiative, which at the end of the day would have recognized Israel. And I don't think that Iran ever withdrew its support from the Arab Peace Initiative, officially at least. So those are a long time ahead of us. Regard to us here and the pursuit of peace, there are a lot of people in our civil society in both Israel and Palestine, particularly amongst young people, who are looking for opportunities to engage. They don't really know how to do it. There's a lot of delegitimation of Israelis and Palestinians who want to do that from within their society. We won't have any significant change until we have a change of leadership. And I hope that that will be coming on both sides, in Israel and in Palestine. President Abbas is in his 12th or 13th year of a 4-year term. He's almost 85 years old. Prime Minister Netanyahu is now the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. He has indictments for 3 charges of corruption against him. And I believe next month he will begin his trial, where he will have to spend a lot of time trying to defend himself so he won't end up in prison. I feel very uncomfortable with the prime minister who is indicted for corruption. This is a lacuna in our law in Israel. Netanyahu, according to Israeli law, can't be a minister in his own government. If you're a minister indicted, you have to resign. You cannot be a teacher in the state of Israel if you're indicted for corruption, not until you're proven guilty. If you're indicted for corruption, you cannot be a teacher. You cannot be a rabbi in a community paid for by the state of Israel, but you can be indicted for corruption and serve as prime minister.
Yes,
Marcelo,
very difficult.
would you allow me to jump into the conversation at this point?
Of course.
Just for you, I would like to ask you, Gershon, to delve into the internal dynamics, political dynamics within Israel and within Palestine. Is there any, at least weak signs, that there might be political change in the foreseeable future, or how do you see this playing out?
Right. On the Israeli side, the only chance of political change is the continuation of the indictment charges against Netanyahu and his appearing in court. And perhaps because he is doing very well in the polls today, he might decide to break up the coalition government that he has today and go to new elections. People here in Israel are talking about new elections perhaps in March. And if that were to happen, because Benny Gantz, the head of the blue-white party that was supposed to be the alternative to Netanyahu, ran on the elections saying that they would not join the Netanyahu government, and immediately after elections joined the Netanyahu government, have lost all of their support in the Israeli in public opinion. We have no clear alternative. The rising star of the Israeli public politics is Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party. Naftali Bennett is a right-wing political extremist who's painted himself in a kind of centralist kind of appeal to the public, taking on the government with its very poor treatment of the corona pandemic in Israel and its poor handling of the economy. And Bennett is trying to paint himself as an alternative, and he's getting a lot of the votes in the public opinion polls for people who voted for blue-white in the past. I think that would be a disaster for Israel if he would be the replacement of Netanyahu. So we have a void, we have a vacuum, a lack of alternative political leadership in Israel that will be filled. There will be new players that will appear on the scene. I hope it's not another bunch of generals who come along and want to rule us, because we've seen too much of that. But we have a dearth of leadership right now. On the Palestinian side, the situation is even worse, because as Abbas has become older and seen with less and less legitimacy, he has become more repressive. There is a lack of democratic free state in Palestine, in the West Bank, of the likes we've never seen before. Palestinian friends tell me that if you write anything on your Facebook page against the Palestinian Authority or against Abbas, you get visited by the Palestinian intelligence forces in the middle of the night. People are afraid to talk. He has very little legitimacy on the street. People want new elections. And the Palestinian house is divided. The situation is bad in the West Bank. It's even worse in Gaza, where you have the Hamas Islamic extremist repressive regime, where there's virtually no political freedom. And Gaza society has become more and more conservative and more religious as Hamas continues to rule there. And of course, the economic situation in Gaza is horrendous. The humanitarian situation, more than 2 million people who are living in total abject poverty with no hope for a future. They're living in a prison, closed in on all sides by Israel on one side, the sea on the other, and Egypt on the other. It's certainly a place where no one wants to live. The overall overwhelming number of Palestinians want elections. They want to be able to choose new leaders. And hopefully when that happens, and it will happen, new figures will rise on the Palestinian side that will offer new opportunities to Palestinians. I think we'll probably see an interim generation in the post-Abbas period of his cronies who will take over. But eventually, Palestine, which is a very educated society, a very dynamic society, a society with an enormous amount of change. And what gives me hope when I look at Palestinian society is the huge number of young Palestinian women who are graduating university. Their numbers are more than young Palestinian men. They're studying science and computers and engineering and mathematics, and they're fighting for their equality and their independence as individuals, as people, as women. And that will eventually have an impact on Palestinian political culture as well.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about new or possible peace brokers between Israel and Palestine, do you see any other country jumping into these discussions? Let's say we've just mentioned the status of Jerusalem and the thing that the moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and a similar move is promised by Brazilian government with Jair Bolsonaro. In the same tune, let's say, because it has to do much more with the evangelical community down here in Brazil than with any sort of idea of peace process in Israel. During the Lula government some years ago, we saw Brazil trying to get more involved in the peace process, or at least to be seen as an independent and trustable partner in a future peace process. Do you see anything like that? And how do you see this moves from Brazilian government to also follow the lead of Trump's United States and moving its embassy to Jerusalem? There's one question from our audience also that goes in this line as well.
So I'll answer that second. My preference, what I've been calling for many years, is for us to create a kind of local OECD, or what I call some kind of forum for security and prosperity in the region that would include Israel and the Palestinians, Egypt and Jordan, now the Emirates, Bahrain, eventually when King Salman passes and Mohammed bin Salman takes over, the Saudis joining in, and this regional formulation of looking at a regional picture of security and stability and prosperity would be the best format for Israel and the Palestinians to confront each other. It would provide Israel with a much broader sense of security. It would provide the Palestinians with a much better sense that they will be able to create a state that will be viable and have an economic viability to it, a political viability to it. This should be supported by Europe, by Russia, by China, by Brazil, by the United States. But I think what we really need to see is our region taking responsibility for ourselves. I don't see any outside actor can come and replace the region for what the region needs to do. Everyone can be helpful. In more cases than not, most of the other countries are not helpful, and they don't go by the saying "do no harm." They end up coming here and being partial and taking a side and or making statements that build expectations, and then those expectations are not met, and we have the next round of violence. So this is very, very problematic. With regard to Brazil moving the embassy, I have no problem with every country in the world recognizing West Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel. But I would hope that when they do that, and if they move their embassy to West Jerusalem, that at the same time they announce that they would be very happy and are waiting for the day to open up the embassy to the state of Palestine in East Jerusalem. Or if Israel and Palestine decide on a confederation or a federation or a hybrid, that they would be happy for their embassy to serve the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. But I think that if it's a unilateral move, only recognizing Israel's rights in Jerusalem, then this is detrimental and harmful to the chances of peace.
And Gershon, in this new configuration of actors in the future peace process, the changing government administration in the US, all the things that are going in the world right now, how do you see the role of multilateral organizations? Just to mention, of course, the biggest one, the United Nations, in this process. Is there still a role apart from its role in humanitarian missions and helping refugees and all this sort of things? Or do you think that this is also something from the past?
I think that international organizations do have a role to play here. I know that some of the more constructive organizations like the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, all these multilateral organizations are very important to the security and to the health of the world. And I think they do have a role to play. I think that we have to see what's going to happen between the United States and Russia and the United States and China to determine whether or not the Security Council can play a positive role here. In the past years, they've been playing superpower politics at the expense of a lot of countries in the region, in the world. And if there can be agreement between the United States, Russia, and China on a particular program that would help create peace here, that would balance the needs and the interests of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people, then it could be a useful place. Otherwise, we have the General Assembly, which is just a debating club that generally supports the Palestinians and creates more animosity amongst Jews and Israelis against the United Nations and international organizations. That's generally not helpful. But the United Nations is a place where at the end of the day, will give legitimacy to any Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. It will have to be brought to the Security Council, to the United Nations to gain international legitimacy. There are issues that could be dealt with in the frame of a Security Council resolution that would be easier to deal with in that framework than for the Israelis and the Palestinians to agree on themselves. One issue, as an example, is for the Palestinians to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, which they haven't been able to do in bilateral negotiations. But if there was an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, and that was written in the text of a Security Council resolution, where Israel is recognized as the nation state of the Jewish people, and Palestine is recognized as the nation state of the Palestinian people, in the framework of a Security Council resolution, the Israelis and the Palestinians wouldn't have a problem.
Marcelo, if you allow me again,
Of
uh,
course.
let me take a more granular perspective, civil society to civil society relations. As far as I think I understood it clear, you're pessimistic in terms of short-term possibilities of political change, but your hopes are placed on long-term social change. In this perspective, an NGO like the one you have founded, what it can do to sort of boost this change in Palestinian society, and how is it possible to work given the broader political context in Israel and in the under the Palestinian Authority government?
I'll give two examples of things that I think that could be done in civil society today. I'm no longer directing the organization that I founded. I left it in 2012 because I thought the next generation of Israelis and Palestinians really had to come in and play a role. But one thing that we had done, and we started doing it very early in the days I founded this joint Israeli-Palestinian organization in 1988. And what we sought to do was to create safe forums for Israeli and Palestinian central figures from the society to have a place where they could meet and exchange ideas and get to know each other. Once the peace process had emerged in the end of 93, 94, the Palestinian Authority was created, we created forums for Israeli and Palestinian government officials, civil servants, to meet on a regular basis. We had an economic working group, a water scientist working group, an environmental working group, a working group on the future of Jerusalem, a group of security officials that were meeting. And there was a time in the late 90s where you would go into every Israeli or Palestinian government ministry and you would meet people there who knew people on the other side. They had ongoing contacts. We used to take them to Turkey for a long weekend where they would spend hours in discussions, but they would also spend hours having a good time together, getting to know each other as people, becoming friends, having this relationship. Today, when you enter Israeli and Palestinian government offices, there is no one in both sides who has any connection with people on the other side. So that's something that if I were active in civil society today and had the financial resources, I would renew immediately. It's very difficult to do because those people can't act on their own. They need permission from the people above them, and that's not easy to get, particularly today when there's no legitimacy for doing it. But I would work very hard to create a safe forum for officials on both sides to re-engage. Another area that I would work very intensively in is in helping to create democratic forums within the city of Jerusalem, particularly for Palestinians to empower themselves, because the 350,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem are leaderless. They cannot, the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to work in Jerusalem, and they are not represented by the Israeli government or the Israeli Jerusalem municipality. So I would, with young Palestinians, work in every single of the 20 some odd neighborhoods in East Jerusalem of creating local boards. I had once suggested to the Palestinian leader in Jerusalem, Faisal Husseini, that they use Israeli law to create a democratic platform for change. They could create a nonprofit company. They could give out shares in this company to every resident of East Jerusalem, every Palestinian, make them shareholders, and then hold elections for a board of directors. Would essentially be a democratic election for a leadership for East Jerusalem. And I would begin to engage young people on the Jewish side of Jerusalem to meet with these young people on the Palestinian side of Jerusalem. This is where we can build leadership and build a movement from the bottom up. It's going against the trend. It's against what the larger society wants, but I think this is what we have to do.
Back to you, Marcel.
Yes, Mr. Baskin, you just mentioned two of the subjects that we've been talking a lot, which is leadership, how hard it is to create new leaderships to take this process and move it forward. You also talk about the needs of a broadened coalition between civil societies, Palestinians and Israelis. And I'd like to know also your take on the role of economy in all of this. You just mentioned briefly economy, the idea of this company that you just mentioned at the end of the answer right now. But we know that lots of the hardship that is going on, for example, in Gaza, has to do also with the economy. And it's linked also with the radicalization of the Palestinian movement there. So do you think that economy, knowing Israel, such an innovative country with so many possibilities of cooperations between these two people in the same land, what's the role and the importance of working also at the same time with economic factor in this?
It's essential. It is essential. And I've always said it makes no sense to me as an Israeli to want to have poor neighbors. It makes no sense. I want to have prosperous neighbors. I want them to succeed. And if we look at every report that's been issued by the World Bank or the United Nations, different economic agencies, trade agencies, we look at every report by the International Monetary Fund on what are the blockages for Palestinian economic development. 90% of them are caused by the occupation, by checkpoints, by Israeli control of movement of people and goods, by the control of the flow of financial resources, on the inability of Palestinians to import and export independent of Israel, the lack of raw materials, the discouragement of investment by not granting diaspora Palestinians permits to be able to live and work in Palestine. There are so many obstacles. I'll give you an example. If you are a company importing a machine from Germany, if you're an Israeli company, it will take you 24 to 48 hours to clear that machine from the port of Ashdod. If you're a Palestinian importing the exact same machine from the exact same factory and it's going to Ramallah or Nablus in the West Bank, it will take you up to 2 weeks to clear the port. During that time, you will pay the extra charges for storage and for security checks. If you're an Israeli importing a container of goods, you will pay for a security check on the container only when the security check happens. And that's done randomly, one of every 20 or 30 or 50 containers. If you're a Palestinian, you'll pay for a security check on every container, whether it happened or it didn't. So how can you compete? You can't. If you're a truck, if you're a factory in Nablus producing goods and you want to send it to Tel Aviv, you have to pay for 2 trucks because your truck can't cross into Israel. You have to change the truck at the crossing point. It's impossible to compete and to develop. So this makes no sense. We need to find out how to deal with the security issues without compounding the situation so that it makes Palestinian goods non-competitive in the local and in the international arena. With regard to Gaza, the Israelis talk about all the time how goods get into Gaza. And it's true, there are 600 to 800 trucks of goods going into Gaza almost every day. But for every 2,500 trucks going into Gaza, 1 comes out. How do you build an economy if you can't send anything outside of your economy? This is the real problem here. There used to be industrial zones on the Israeli-Gaza border, which employed thousands of Palestinians from Gaza. There were Palestinians who owned factories in these industrial zones. Those are all closed. There used to be tens of thousands of workers coming out of Gaza working inside of Israel. Israel needs that labor in construction, in agriculture, but we don't let them cross. We need to deal with the situation. The problem here is also because there are 4 Israelis in Gaza being held hostage by Hamas. 2 Israeli soldiers who were killed in the war of the summer of 2014, Oron Shaul and Hadar Golden, and 2 Israeli civilians who are presumed to be alive, Avera Mengistu, an Ethiopian Israeli, and Hisham Asayed, a Bedouin Israeli. Both of them are known to be mentally ill on medication. They both managed to cross into Gaza almost 6 years ago, and they're being held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, who want to negotiate a large prisoner exchange like with the Gilad Shalit case. Now, Israel has agreed to reduce a lot of the impediments of the siege on Gaza, which has been there since 2007, but it will not implement those agreements that have been made through the United Nations and through Egypt, through Turkey and others, while there remains Israeli citizens in Gaza, the two bodies and the two civilians. So we're in a kind of closed circle here where we need to resolve this issue of the prisoners, of the people being held hostage and the two bodies of the soldiers in order to implement the changes that will enable Gaza to open up. But it's a very difficult negotiation and the gaps are still very wide between Israel and Hamas on that issue.
Mm-hmm. But you've dealt yourself with Hamas before. Do you think that there is any possibility of dealing with it again now, and there is room for at some point Hamas even recognizing the state of Israel? What would it take for this to happen? It's such an important move forward.
Brian, I don't think Hamas is ready to recognize the state of Israel, but I think it is possible to arrive at a long-term ceasefire with Hamas. Hamas has an element of pragmatic leadership. This is to be different from moderate leadership. There's a difference between being moderate and being pragmatic. And I don't think that we've reached the point where we can describe the leadership in Hamas as being moderate, but there are pragmatic people there. Hamas is currently undergoing their election process. Their election process is secretive. It's determined by people in Gaza, in the West Bank, people from Hamas abroad in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, and in the Israeli prisons, Hamas prisoners. And they have a complicated election process where they're electing the leadership now. And there are certain people who are competing for the top positions and for the Shura Council, which is the leadership, the Politburo, so to speak, of the Hamas leadership. These elections should be completed in the coming months, and we will then know who comes on top. There's one person in particular that many Israelis talk about, a man named Yahya Sinwar, who spent 18 years or 17 years in Israeli prison. He is the current leader in Gaza, serving as the so-called prime minister of Gaza. He is competing now for the #1 position of the Hamas leadership. He is thought to be more pragmatic than others. And it's believed that if Yahya Sinwar comes out on top, that it might be possible to negotiate a long-term ceasefire, meaning a 10-year ceasefire with Hamas. It'll be a very difficult negotiation. I think that the Israeli side needs to break the taboo on talking to Hamas. I encourage international players to break their taboo on dealing with Hamas, even if secretly through back channels, to reach out and engage. It's probably because Hamas is designated a terrorist organization by the European Union, by the United States, by other countries, probably Brazil as well, which limits the ability of diplomats here to engage with Hamas. But there are countries that don't designate Hamas as a terrorist organization or are not part of the European Union. And those channels should be used to begin to have a serious dialogue behind closed doors and secret back channels. I tell the people in Israel, Israeli officials that I engaged with, if I were you, I would pick up the phone, call them. Maybe they won't answer, maybe they will. I would keep calling until they answer and say, listen, we have to talk to each other. We're living next to each other. Even if we're enemies, we have to talk to each other.
And as you mentioned, possible new leadership that could take part in this future negotiation. There's a question that one of the people in the audience, Guta Hagarty, is trying to make here, and I'll get in it right now. It's your take on Mohammed Dahlan as well as a possibility of somebody that can also take part in this future peace process.
Right. Mohammed Dahlan, for people who don't know, is a person from Gaza. He grew up in a refugee camp. He was actually a classmate of Yahya Sinwar, the leader from Hamas. When Yasser Arafat came back to Palestine and created the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Dahlan was the head of the internal security forces in Gaza. He built up a very strong relationship. He spent time in Israeli prison. He speaks Hebrew. He had a very good relationship with many of the Israeli leaders who worked in the field of security. He was in charge of security at the time of the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and the eventual Hamas takeover in Gaza. He was blamed by many people within the Fatah movement for losing Gaza to Hamas. And he created a rivalry with President Abbas, which ended up leading to Dahlan's exile. He's been living for the past years in Abu Dhabi. He's very close to the leadership of the Emirates, of the United Arab Emirates. He's built a reputation as a very shrewd businessman and a multi-millionaire, supported also by the Emirates. He's also been used in the region for negotiations. He was involved in the negotiations on the now river dams with Ethiopia and Eritrea and in other places. He has a lot of skills. He's invested a lot of money in the last couple of years in the West Bank and in Gaza, and people see him as a political player. I spoke to someone, one of Dahlan's people, last week. I met with him talking about a future role for Dahlan, particularly because he also has the backing of the United Arab Emirates. And most people think that he won't actually put his name into the hat if there were elections for the leadership in Palestine, but he will probably back Marwan Barghouti, who's the Palestinian Fatah leader who was imprisoned by Israel for being the leader of the Second Intifada. Marwan Barghouti is serving 5 consecutive life sentences plus 40 years. I don't know how you serve more than 1 life sentence, let alone 5 plus 40 years. But Marwan is someone who's viewed by most Palestinians as a desired leader. In fact, in public opinion polls in Palestine, when asked who would you like to see replace Mahmoud Abbas, Marwan Barghouti is the person who overwhelmingly wins in those prospective elections. So a coalition between Dahlan and Marwan Barghouti could be quite interesting. Both of them being in a kind of exile, Marwan in prison in Israel and Dahlan in the United Arab Emirates. But it would be a very interesting thing to watch, how Israel would to deal with a situation like that, where you would have a democratically elected president in Israeli prison, supported by Mohammed Dahlan, who's a strong player in the region and someone that I believe the Israeli government, people in the government engage with already today.
So these are two possible...
Reservation, perhaps, if I could.
Okay,
Dahlan,
of course.
Dahlan is thought to be corrupted, or corrupt leader. I have always cautioned Israeli leaders that we should not want to be in business with corrupt leaders. Just because they're corruptible doesn't mean that they will be playing the game that we want to play, that we will be involved in something that we should be involved in. And actually our desire as a country should be to deal with honest people with integrity, and not people who are viewed by their own people as being corrupt. And this is perhaps part of the legacy that we have in this region. And one of the many reasons why the peace process failed was that so many people who were involved, particularly in the level of security, were engaged in all kinds of corrupt businesses at the end of the day, either while they were serving or more after they got out of their official positions, engaged in businesses that were considered corrupt. And I don't like that. That doesn't ring as something that we should support.
But so take it just for this point, just to make it clear, do you think that this is more important, for example, than the dealing with notorious dictators like the monarchies of the Gulf, or Mohammed bin Salman and these people that may not be corrupt on the outside, but also have a lot of questions to answer, let's say?
Yeah, I think it's very, very problematic. And if Israel were a superpower with the United States, perhaps it could use more of its political economic might to push its values forward. I think that the state of Israel has very little ability to impose democratic values on other countries, particularly when we have such a lack of democracy in our own dealings with the Palestinian people living under our own rule. How can we talk about democracy when half the people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, living under Israeli control, don't enjoy democracy? So it's a little bit two-faced for us to be preaching to our neighbors about the lack of democracy.
Christian, you just, sorry, Marcel, you just touched a sore point, which is the, what do you make of the people who says that Israel is in face of a dilemma of either being a Jewish state or a democratic one?
Right. I think it's very clear that today, 53 years after 1967, that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, half the population is not Jewish and is not living under democracy. And Israel, which defines itself as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people today, is neither. It's not Jewish and it's not democratic. And this is the reality that we have to deal with. It's not a dilemma, it's a reality. Israel today is not the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. And those people who want it to be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people have to make decisions on who we are and what we want to see here. But the biggest problem that we face is that I'm not sure it's possible to have a viable two-state solution anymore. This is the greatest existential threat that the state of Israel faces. It might have been viable 5 years ago. I think that the governments of Israel in the last years have blocked the possibilities of creating a viable partition plan that would enable Palestinians to have a state of their own next to Israel living in peace. We're so entrenched in the settlement enterprise and the control, Israeli control over the West Bank. Even we talked about the possibility of land swaps. If Israel, no Israeli government can remove 500,000 or more settlers from the West Bank. It can't be done anymore. So the only way that we can have a viable two-state solution is if the Palestinians agree that the settlements or the majority of the settlements there will remain. But that will require a territorial swap of the Palestinians getting land from inside of Israel proper. The Israeli government of Netanyahu in the last year has built in the possible swap areas, limiting the possibility for those swaps. So I think in a way that Israel has defeated Oslo. Israel didn't want Oslo. Israel didn't want the two-state solution. And now the Palestinian people look at them and say, okay, you guys don't want it. What's the alternative? What are you proposing to us? There is no way to jump from a two-state solution to a one secular democratic state of Israel-Palestine. It's just not viable. We're going to have to come up with something else, a hybrid situation, a confederacy. There is a plan called Two States, One Homeland, which is known also as a land for all, which proposes two states with a confederation that Israel and Palestine will function sort of as a European Union, where the border would be the 1967 border, but no one would have to move. Israelis could live where they are in a Palestinian state as citizens of Israel and residents of Palestine. And they propose that an equal number of the settlers of refugees be allowed to return to Israel proper. So you can be a Polish citizen living in Germany, working in Germany, retain your Polish citizenship and live in Germany in the same way that Palestinians in Israel could live in each other's state. They propose that Jerusalem be a separate autonomous zone serving as the capital for these two states. Maybe these are the kind of new thinking that we need to approach and look at, begin to talk about and see how they're viable. It seems very far-fetched, but the continuation of the status quo, where we call ourselves the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, is simply lying to ourselves and lying to the world. And we need to confront that. We need to look in the mirror and determine who we are and what we want to be.
Mr. Bashkin, there was a question here from our audience, and as you mentioned Oslo, I'd like to get back to it just a bit, because some people say that at that point in time, too much demands and too much burden was put in the shoulders of Israel, and not enough responsibility was asked from the Palestinians. And I'd like to hear from you, what do you think are the basic demands that you can't move away, demands that must be made to Palestinians, and what sort of things can be asked from the Israelis, realistically?
The number one demand of Israel with regard to the Palestinians is on the issue of security. There's nothing that's more important for Israel than the issue of security. And that means fighting terrorism, fighting against the will of Palestinians to kill Israelis in order to prevent Israel from existing or from Israel having legitimacy. This is the most important thing. And it requires security cooperation and coordination. No one expects the Palestinians to have 100% effectiveness in fighting against terrorism. And what the Israelis always demanded was 100% motivation. They had to demonstrate, they have to demonstrate that they are fighting against the extremists within their own territory seriously. There were claims by Israel that the Palestinians had a revolving door in the prison. Israel would give them names of people, they would arrest them, they would spend a day or two or a week in prison and then release them, and they would come out and be terrorists. So this is the number one issue. And going along with that is also in the textbook issue and the preaching in mosques, We need public diplomacy where people are talking about peace and they mean it, which means that you have to educate for peace in your schools. If textbooks are what we want to impart to the next generation, it's an expression of our values. It's an expression of what we really believe. And if you look at Palestinian textbooks, they've gotten worse over the years. They're worse today than they were 10 years ago, and they don't teach peace. They don't express a desire for peace, and this needs to change. This would be a great expression by Palestinian leadership to demonstrate that they are serious about peace. And likewise, the same thing, what's preached in the mosques by Muslim preachers is a reflection of what the society believes and the society wants to hear. We don't have enough Muslim preachers in the mosques in Palestine preaching peace. So these are the three issues: security, the education system, and what we hear in the religious centers.
And still thinking about peace, and there's a question that Guta Hagat is asking here that was also in the back of my mind in the beginning of our conversation, but I forgot to ask you. It is, do you see any possibility, any room for something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to hear the grievances of both sides and to try and overcome the resentments that has been strengthened for the past decades? Is there anything like that? Because we've seen it worked somehow in South Africa. Can it work something like that in Israel?
100%. It will be very necessary, but can only happen after there's a political agreement. It can't happen before a political agreement, and this is very unfortunate because it would have a huge impact. If we look at an organization, one of the most important organizations that exist in this region is the Bereaved Families Forum, also known as the Parent Circle. These are Israelis and Palestinians who have lost members of their close family, fathers, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, children in the conflict, and they have said, we want our relative to be the last. And they're dedicated to engage with each other. They meet on a regular basis. They preach within their own society, saying, I paid the price. My son was killed. My father was killed. I don't want the next generation, the next people to be killed. This is a kind of reconciliation and truth process that is already taking place. This is the organization, together with Combatants for Peace, who are former Israeli army officers and Palestinian militants, armed Palestinians, who have come together and said, we are laying down our weapons and we want to preach nonviolence and come together. These two organizations have organized now, I think for 13 years, on Memorial Day in Israel, the alternative Memorial Day ceremony, which is a truth and reconciliation ceremony that takes place in Israel on the day before Independence Day, on Memorial Day. It's a joint Israeli-Palestinian ceremony that takes place. It was physically attended by thousands of people over the last years. This past year, because of Corona, it was done over Zoom and YouTube and Facebook, and they had more than 100,000 participants locally and worldwide. And this is, in my mind, the most important ceremony that takes place in this land, in Israel and in Palestine every year. And it is exactly that. It's the first steps toward truth and reconciliation.
And I think that we can all agree that one of these steps also is knowing more about each other, both sides knowing more about each other. And we've seen some initiatives in that way lately. I remember, I forgot his name, but there's a French artist who made this project that you had the chance to listen to what a Palestinian fighter would say, and a Palestinian audience would have the chance to listen from a normal Israeli soldier and trying to know more about each other. At the same time, if we talk about culture, pop culture, we've seen also in recent years some TV series very, very popular around all the West, like Fauda, for example. But we don't know sometimes that if it reinforces Manichaeism, or is it good to put the situations there for the broader public to know, with the broader audience. What do you think is the role of culture and this culture of empathy in this process, trying to pursuing peace always?
I'm not sure that Fauda is the kind of series that we're looking for, although it's quite interesting, and it's quite interesting to see the reviews of Fauda both in Israeli society and Palestinian society, and outside the region. I meet our neighbors in Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt and other places who have seen Fauda and are quite entertained by it. But I think that the tool that we have that we don't exploit enough is our language. Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages. If you speak Hebrew or you speak Arabic, you already know hundreds of words in the other language without being aware that you even know them. And if we stop perceiving this as the language of the enemy and encouraged many more people to study the other language, I think it would be creating wonderful bridges toward the lives and culture of the other people living here. There's been a sharp increase in the study of Arabic in Israel and the study of Hebrew in the West Bank over the last years, and this is very encouraging. It's not enough. We have a number of bilingual schools now in Israel. I think there's a network of 8 bilingual schools in Israel now, and a number of bilingual kindergartens where you have a Hebrew speaker and an Arabic speaker teacher in every classroom. And this is wonderful. This, to me, is the ideal thing that we should be doing and encouraging. Once you understand someone's language, you open up their heart. If you walk into an Arab home and you just say, marhaba, assalamu alaikum, people's heart open. Israelis are always impressed when non-Israelis say shalom, when they greet you in Hebrew. When you learn someone's language, you really open up a door and a window to a culture and a society. And the main thing is you open up people's hearts. So this is something we can do. The other thing I want to say is that we have unique opportunities today through social media to do positive things. Unfortunately, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and these other medias are used for hate. But it's so easy. I tell students all the time, if you want to do something, find someone on Facebook, someone you don't know. Look for Ahmed or Fatmi or Samira or Yossi or Anat. Knock on their door on Facebook and say, hey, I'm so-and-so. I want to know you. Tell me your story. Tell me who you are. Don't argue. Don't start by picking a fight and making positions. Tell someone that you want to listen to them. I've never been told by anyone in my whole life experience all over the world, when I say, I want to know you, tell me your story, that someone said to me, no.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Gerson, just a quick one here, Sergio.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's just talking about perspectives of peace in the Middle East. We can't, of course, run away from one very delicate and complex thing, which is religion. And there are quite a few questions from our audience that comes to this subject. I'd like to know from you, what's the role of religious leaders nowadays in both sides? Is there also peace initiatives, or are they too much radicalized from both positions and very strengthening their positions? How do you see their role?
It's a very complex issue, because at the bottom line, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict between Judaism and Islam. It's not a religious conflict. It has very big religious interest and concerns, holy spaces, the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, al-Aqsa, as the primary example of a holy place, which is at the center of the conflict. But we have to remember that Judaism and Islam are not at war here. Our problem is, because the conflict is national, ethnic, and identity conflict, the voices of religion in Israel and in Palestine and around the region have often, more often than not, been voices of extremism and not voices of moderation. There are moderate religious leaders in the region. Their voices are too low, and there aren't enough of them. They're not strong enough. Often they're marginalized within their own communities. They don't have legitimacy. Religion has to play a positive role in the making of peace here, in reaching out and making agreements, and in materializing those agreements into peace between people. It will have to happen. Unfortunately, until now, religion has played a negative role in the conflict. That could change. The head of the Islamic courts in Palestine, who's a very close advisor to Mahmoud Abbas, to President Abbas, I asked him, what's the issue with you not agreeing for Jews to pray on what they call the Temple Mount, and you call Al-Aqsa? What's the problem? Because from the point of view of Islamic religious law of Sharia, there's no prohibition for a Jew to pray in a mosque. It's not prohibited. He said to me, it's not a religious issue. It's a political issue. It's an issue over control. If we had recognized control over this physical space, that's 1 square kilometer, we could foresee in the future a time where Jews could come up there and pray. But our fear is that they want to take the space, they want to knock down the mosques, they want to build the temple, they want to tunnel underneath to make the mosque collapse. We can't allow that to happen, so they can't pray there. They can't have any power there. This is a political issue. It's not a religious issue. So we need to separate the politics from the religion and enable the good message of religion to have a voice. Right now, it's mostly, as I said, unfortunately, a negative voice.
Pleasure.
Marcel, I have one last question. I'm afraid we are approaching the end of the conversation, but you close it, right? So my last question is kind of personal one, Gershon. It is, what were your hopes and your greatest hopes and fears when you moved to Israel in 1978? And to what extent hopes were fulfilled and fears were mitigated, assuaged? And what are your hopes and fears going forward?
This is one of the most difficult questions for me to answer, because I look now, all these years later, that if I was a 22-year-old university graduate living in New York City today, asking myself, is Israel the place where I want to live? I would probably come to a negative answer. And I don't want to say that my life decisions have been wrong and I'm sorry for what I did, but I would not make that decision today. Israel is not the kind of place I want it to be. It's not the kind of place where I'm sure that the young people living here, my own children, will want to stay here forever. One of my kids, my daughter, moved to France, the south of France, 2 years ago. I don't know if that's a permanent move or not. And she and her Israeli husband bought a house in the south of France and are living there in a picture postcard, in a wonderful life, even though COVID is very strong in that region today. In retrospect, they have a wonderful life there. They miss Israel. They miss their friends here. They miss the culture and the society. But they did not, and they have a baby, a 3-year-old daughter. They did not want to raise their child in the political environment in which we live in Israel. And that saddens me enormously. I haven't lost hope in Israel. I think this is an amazing country. I think Israeli society is so vibrant. There's such a potential for good here. We also have, unfortunately, a huge potential for bad. I participate in the demonstrations almost every day in Israel against our current government. And I get cursed. I've been violently attacked. It was on television even, for standing with a sign against our prime minister. The hatred, the divisions in our society is frightening today. It scares me. And I tell people, I understand you're not agreeing with me. Let's argue, let's talk. Why do you curse me? Why are you saying that Hitler should have taken care of my family? Imagine a Jew saying that to me in Israel, cursing me for standing with a sign protesting against our prime minister. This is something which bewilders me and saddens me deeply. We need to overcome these divisions. I think America is facing the same thing. Perhaps Brazil is facing it as well. We have these divisive leaders.
Sounds familiar to me, yeah.
We have these very divisive leaders who have enhanced the hatred within our society and the divisions. And as our politics have become identity politics, we've created these divisions and made them wider. And this is a challenge for our times. We can't do it here unless we have a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. This is the issue that divides us more than anyone else. One of the curses that people yell at me is that I'm an Arab lover. My response to them is, yeah, I am. I love Arabs, I love Jews, I love Italians, I love Brazilians. I'm not at war with people. I want to live in peace with people. And loving your neighbor is, to me, not a bad thing. I think it's something that we should seek to do, even though it's not about love and hate. It's about real issues. It's about real conflict. but we need to resolve them. And this is a conflict made by people, and it has to be resolved by people. And we won't resolve the divisions in our own society if we don't resolve the divisions between us and our neighbors. So it's a package deal, and we have to do it. The thing that perhaps gives me hope for the future, this is a kind of bizarre kind of hope, is that we're not going anywhere. We're not leaving. The Palestinians are not leaving. We're all here. We're going to have to face each other. We're going to have to sit down. We're going to have to resolve this. 1 state, 2 states, 10 states, whatever the formula is, no one's leaving. We're all here. We all belong here. This is our home.
Gershon, Sergio, should I start and closing it? How are you?
I think you should. Yeah, I think you should.
Okay.
Yeah. We have 5 minutes more.
Okay, so I'll make just the last question. We could keep talking here for the whole day. We have to talk about the water issue in the Middle East and the participation of the other neighbors.
Water is so water equals money, and the amount of money required to produce water keeps going down. So it's a really easy issue to deal with.
It's an easy issue to deal with. So you almost answered the last question that I wanted to make, which is we know all the difficulties in the way of peace and the pursuit of peace of Middle East. We've listened about the problems with religion, with the lack of leadership, with the lack of mediators. Palestinians just lost another one 2 weeks ago, Saeb Erekat, and we don't see who is the new one that would fill this gap. And Hannah Ashrawi is not the one, because we need new generations and everything. But I would like to hear from you, what does feed your hopes in the possible future of peace between Israelis and Palestinians? The worries are all there. The odds are against this idea. But at the same time, as you mentioned, you're not moving away. Palestinians aren't moving away. They won't give up of their land and of the idea of a country or anything like that. So what keeps feeding your hopes in a better future and a brighter tomorrow?
It's really hard to stay hopeful. Let's recognize that. It's not an easy thing to do, but I was born an optimist, and I'm optimist all the time, and I try to look at for the best possible scenario, but I think it's going to take a lot of hard work with a lot of support from within and from without around the world. It encourages me that we're having this conversation. It encourages me that my weekly column, which I started writing in February of 2005 in the Jerusalem Post has become extremely right-wing and religious, and I'm probably the most hated columnist in the Jerusalem Post. But over the last few months, my column is now being translated and published in Al-Quds newspaper, a Palestinian daily newspaper in Arabic. And it turns out I'm one of the most popular columnists in Al-Quds newspaper. If you go into Al-Quds newspaper and look at the op-ed pages, I have more clicks on my article than almost anyone else who writes in Al-Quds these days, maybe because I'm presenting some new, fresh ideas for most Palestinian readers who don't really have an opportunity to read Israelis who are addressing them as well as the Israeli public with the kind of message that I have. Of course, I already mentioned young Palestinian women who are breaking away from the bounds that have held them backwards in their own society for reasons of a traditional religious society, who are now seeking higher education and getting it. 60% and above of all university graduates in Palestine today are women, and they're studying those professions that are needed to create a vibrant economy in Palestine: computers and science and engineering and mathematics. And they're fighting for their own independence. They're not fighting for peace. They're fighting to become individuals who are free within their own society, to act on their own, to have an economic base, to get out of the control of the traditions of the society. That will have an impact on Palestinian society. And by the way, it's not just happening in Palestine. It's happening all over the Arab world. It's happening in Egypt. It's happening in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, all over. The role of women is essential for social and political and economic change. And it's happening in this region. They will find partners amongst Israeli women. One of the biggest peace movements in Israel today is Women Wage Peace. I think they have nearly 60,000 members. In my mind, their message is not sharp enough and not focused enough. They try to be general, but they've brought together 60,000 Israeli women who are saying peace must be made, it must be on the agenda of the government, and it can't be done without women, which I agree with totally. We need more women involved in this process, and it gives me hope that we're seeing more assertive women who will hopefully get into politics and play a much more important role in our militaristic societies. So these are the things that perhaps give me a little hope, and maybe we can share that hope with the people listening and watching today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
It was a real privilege, honor, and pleasure.
And of course, my book, which is supposed to be coming out in Brazil, in Portuguese, it is out in English, of course, and available on Amazon in both electronic form and hard copy. I'm sure that there must be Amazon in Brazil as well, that you can probably...
Yeah, they're everywhere. When it is supposed to be published here?
That you should speak to Sheila about, because she took the initiative to get it translated.
All right. All right.
So Sheila Mann can give all the details about the book.
January.
I was supposed to come to Brazil when the pandemic erupted to do a round of talks about the book and to present it. It has now come out in Arabic. There's a Kuwaiti citizen who read the book, said this has to be in Arabic. He paid for it to be translated, found a publishing house in Jordan that now published it, and it's available in Arabic. Now I'm left with the challenge of translating it to Hebrew.
Great.
Very good.
Thank you very much for this honor.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom,
Shabbat shalom.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you. Marcelo, valeu, hein? Foi ótimo.
Obrigado, hein, Sérgio.
Obrigado,
Valeu, pessoal.
Grande abraço. Grande abraço aí, gente. Beijos, abraços.
Valeu, pessoal.